November 19th, 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The world had shrunk to the space between three pine trees. Rain, cold and relentless, dripped from the shattered branches, tracing paths through the grime on Anneliese Schmidt's face. Each drop felt like a tiny hammer against her skin. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth and cordite, was a physical weight in her lungs. For 2 days, the sound had been constant, a symphony of oblivion composed by artillery shells, the angry chatter of MG-42s, and the deeper, rhythmic thud of American machine guns. Now an unnatural silence pressed in, broken only by the drip of water and the ragged, shallow breaths of the handful of survivors in her signals bunker. She was a Luftwaffenhelferin, a signals auxiliary. She wasn't a frontline soldier, but the front had come to her, swallowing her whole. Her headset was dead. The wire connecting them to command had been severed hours ago by a shell that had turned Sergeant Kleist into a red mist. Anneliese had curled into a ball, hands clamped over her ears, as the earth heaved and the concrete around her groaned. Now she just sat, clutching a useless microphone, her knuckles white. A boy from the Hitler Youth, no older than 16, was weeping silently in the corner, his face buried in his knees. The other two, a pair of exhausted Wehrmacht veterans with 1,000-yard stares, simply watched the bunker entrance, their Kar 98K rifles held loosely in their laps. They weren't waiting for orders. They were waiting for the end. You can feel that kind of waiting. It's a coldness that starts in your bones and spreads outward, making the damp chill of the forest feel like a warm blanket by comparison. It's the certainty that every path forward has been closed. Anneliese's propaganda-fueled certainty had evaporated days ago, washed away by the rain and the blood. The stories of American monsters, of savages who took no prisoners, now echoed in the terrifying silence. Survival instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Every direction was a wall of green, mist, and metal. The sound when it came was not the roar of an engine or the crump of a mortar. It was the soft squelch of a boot in mud. Then another. The two veterans stiffened. Their rifles came up, movements slow and deliberate, as if moving through water. One of them, a corporal named Haas, put a finger to his lips. Anneliese's heart, which had been a dull, tired drum, suddenly hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pressed herself further against the damp concrete wall, trying to become invisible. The weeping boy went rigid, his sobs catching in her throat. Heavy, guttural shouts echoed from outside. English. The words were meaningless, but the tone was pure, predatory command. Haas writ his lips. He glanced at his comrade, a silent, grim exchange passing between them. They knew. Anneliese knew. This was it. The door to the bunker was a flimsy piece of wood, already splintered. A heavy boot kicked it open, sending it crashing against the wall. Silhouetted against the gray, misty light stood a giant. He was tall, broad, draped in a rain-soaked poncho, his face obscured by the shadow of his M1 helmet. The long, menacing shape of a rifle was held at the ready. More figures appeared behind him. They moved with a fluid confidence that seemed alien in this broken landscape. They were huge, well-fed, their uniforms a different shade of wet, muddy green. One of them barked a command. Hands up, Hände hoch, raus. The words were sharp and patient. Haas hesitated for a fraction of a second, his rifle still pointed toward the floor. It was a fatal pause. The crack of the American M1 Garand was deafening in the enclosed space. Haas was thrown backward as if by an invisible fist, a dark flower blooming on his chest. His comrade, without thinking, raised his own rifle. A volley of shots followed, a storm of noise and violence that filled the small bunker. Anneliese squeezed her eyes shut, a scream trapped in her throat. When she opened them, the two veterans were still. The boy was shrieking, a high, thin sound of pure terror. One of the Americans stepped over Haas's body and grabbed the boy by the collar, dragging him out into the rain. Another soldier leveled his rifle at Anneliese. His eyes, visible beneath the helmet's brim, were cold and tired. You, out, now. She raised her hands, a tremor starting in them that she couldn't stop. As she stumbled out into the mud, past the bodies of men she had shared coffee with that morning, the canvas flap of a waiting GMC truck was pulled back. She was pushed, shoved, herded with others into the dark, cavernous space. The canvas flap dropped, plunging her into a rumbling darkness. She was no longer a soldier. She was cargo.
The journey was a blur of motion and misery. The GMC deuce-and-a-half truck churned through the mud-clogged roads of the Hürten, its engine a constant groaning complaint. Inside, 24 German prisoners were packed shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating dark. Anneliese was pressed between a pale-faced Luftwaffe officer with a bandaged arm and the sobbing boy from the bunker, whose terror had subsided into a state of shivering shock. The truck smelled of wet wool, stale sweat, and fear. Every lurch and sway of the vehicle sent a jolt through her exhausted body. With each mile they traveled west, away from the front, the reality of her situation settled deeper into her bones. She was a prisoner of war, a number, a piece of human wreckage to be processed and stored. The stories she'd been told her whole life swirled in her mind. Americans were gangsters, criminals, decadent and cruel. They would take what they wanted. They would discard what they didn't. She tried to make herself smaller, to retreat into the worn fabric of her greatcoat, hoping to be overlooked. She listened to the low murmurs of the men around her. Some spoke of an SS unit that had been captured and shot. Others whispered about Allied leaflets promising fair treatment under the Geneva Convention, but no one seemed to believe it. Hope was a dangerous currency here. After what felt like an eternity, the truck slowed, its brakes hissing. Light flooded the interior as the canvas flap was thrown open again. "Everybody out, schnell." The command was harsh, impersonal. Anneliese blinked against the sudden gray light of dusk, her eyes struggling to adjust. They were in the courtyard of what looked like a large farm or a small rural school, somewhere just inside the German border near Aachen, a temporary collection point. Barbed wire had been hastily strung around the perimeter. American soldiers from the 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, as she would later learn, stood guard, their faces grim and smeared with grime. They looked as tired as she felt. Corporal John Riley watched the new batch of prisoners tumble out of the truck. It was the same scene he'd witnessed a dozen times in the past week, a collection of ghosts in field gray uniforms. Some were arrogant, defiant. Others were broken boys who looked like they should be in school. Most were just hollowed-out men, their fight completely extinguished. His job was simple: keep them organized, keep them quiet, and prevent any trouble. He carried his M1 rifle slung over his shoulder, the familiar weight a constant grim comfort. He was a farm boy from Ohio, and nothing on the farm had prepared him for the Hürten forest or the sight of so much death. Anneliese was herded into a line with the others. She kept her eyes fixed on the muddy ground in front of her. One by one they were searched, pockets emptied, belts removed. A sergeant with a clipboard and a pencil stub methodically took down names and ranks, his German thick with an American accent. When it was her turn, a soldier ran his hands quickly over her coat. The touch was professional, detached, yet it made her skin crawl. "Name?" the sergeant asked, not looking up. "Anneliese Schmidt," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Rank?" "Luftwaffenhelferin." The sergeant grunted, scribbled it down. He looked up at her then, his gaze lingering for a moment. She saw not malice, but a profound weariness. He gestured with his head. "In the barn, move." The barn was a vast, cold space. The air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and unwashed bodies. Hundreds of German prisoners were already inside. A sea of gray uniforms sprawled across the straw-covered stone floor. The only light came from a few bare bulbs hanging from the high rafters, casting long, distorted shadows. The noise was a constant low hum of conversation, coughing, and groans. A perimeter had been roped off inside, creating a large holding pen patrolled by armed guards. It was a human cage. Riley was on guard duty that evening, walking the perimeter inside the barn. He saw her then, properly for the first time. The new female prisoner. He'd noticed her in the processing line. She was small, swimming in her oversized greatcoat, with dark hair plastered to her forehead by the rain. Now she stood just inside the entrance, looking utterly lost, a small island in the churning sea of men. She found a space against the far wall, away from the main throng, and slid down to the floor, pulling her knees up to her chest. She wrapped her arms around them, a defensive posture, as if trying to physically hold herself together. Riley continued his patrol, the rhythmic crunch of his boots on the straw the only sound he made. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. Unlike some of the others who stared with defiance or pleaded for cigarettes, she just stared at the floor, perfectly still, as if believing that if she didn't move, the monsters couldn't see her. The barn was cold, a damp chill seeping up from the stone. Her new reality was settling in. A cold stone floor, the press of bodies, and the impassive gaze of American guards on the other side of the rope.
The days bled into one another, each a gray copy of the last. The routine of the collection point was one of monotonous misery. In the mornings, they were given a cup of thin, bitter coffee and a piece of hard bread. At midday, a ladle of watery soup. In the evening, more bread. It was enough to keep them alive, but not enough to silence the gnawing ache in their stomachs. For Anneliese, the hunger was a constant companion, but it was the cold that truly seeped into her soul. At night, the temperature in the barn plummeted. The thin layer of straw on the stone floor offered little insulation against the damp chill that radiated from the earth itself. The men huddled together for warmth, a great shivering mass of defeated soldiers. Anneliese remained on her small patch of floor against the wall. The men, by some unspoken rule, gave her a small bubble of space. She was an anomaly, a reminder of a world outside the grim fraternity of the front line. She spent her hours in a state of hypervigilance, observing everything. She learned the guards' routines, the way they shifted their weight, the sound of their boots, the moments they would light a cigarette and stare out into the rainy darkness. They were a mix of types. Some were loud and arrogant, enjoying their power over the vanquished. Others were quiet, professional, their faces blank masks of duty. And then there was the one named Riley. Corporal Riley was different. He wasn't soft, but he wasn't cruel. He performed his duties with a quiet efficiency that was somehow more unnerving than open hostility. When he distributed the meager rations, he made sure everyone got their share, his eyes scanning the crowd to quell any potential disputes before they began. He never spoke to the prisoners beyond short, necessary commands. Yet Annalise felt his eyes on her more than once. It wasn't a leering gaze like some of the others. It was observational, curious. It made her deeply uncomfortable. She was an insect under glass, a specimen to be studied. Every time she felt his gaze, she would instinctively pull her greatcoat tighter, tucking her chin to her chest, trying to vanish. What was he looking for? A sign of weakness? A reason to single her out? Her mind, conditioned by years of propaganda and the recent trauma of the front, could only interpret his attention as a precursor to something terrible. Kindness in her world was a weapon. It was a tool used to lower your guard before the real cruelty began. She had seen it in her own ranks, the charming officer who would smile at you one moment and sign an execution order the next. She trusted nothing and no one, least of all a silent American corporal who seemed to be watching her. One evening, Riley was walking his patrol when he saw her preparing to sleep. Like many of the others, she had rolled up her heavy wool greatcoat to use as a pillow. It was a lumpy, inadequate substitute for the real thing. He watched as she tried to adjust it, her movements stiff from the cold. She finally settled, lying on her side, facing the wall, a small, curled figure trying to find a moment's peace in a world of harsh angles and cold stone. The sight struck him. It was a small detail, but it cut through the dehumanizing haze of war. She wasn't just prisoner 734. She was a young woman, not much older than her own sister, trying to sleep on a rock-hard floor with a coat for a pillow. He thought of his own bunk in the barracks they'd set up in the town's requisitioned schoolhouse. He had a cot, 2 wool blankets, and a pillow. It wasn't much, but it was heaven compared to this. The pillow was small, lumpy with cotton, but it was soft. It was his own, a small piece of civilization he'd carried with him from a rear echelon supply depot. He finished his patrol, his mind working. The idea was absurd. It was radernization. It was against the rules. More than that, it was pointless. What good would one pillow do in this ocean of suffering? It would do nothing to end the war, nothing to bring back the friends he'd lost in the forest. It was a meaningless gesture. But the image of her, curled up on the cold floor, wouldn't leave his head. He was tired of the killing, tired of the hate. He just wanted to do one small thing that wasn't about destruction. He wanted to, for a single moment, push back against the tide of misery that had consumed them all. He turned, walking back towards the administrative building, then stopped. An idea, simple and profoundly out of place, had taken root in the frozen mud of his thoughts.
The low hum of conversation in the barn died down as the sun set, replaced by the sounds of men settling in for another cold night. Coughs echoed in the cavernous space. Men shifted in the straw, trying to find a position that offered some relief from the unforgiving floor. Annalise lay on her side, her makeshift greatcoat pillow digging into her cheek. She was not asleep, but in that gray state between exhaustion and vigilance, her senses still on high alert. The main doors of the barn creaked open, casting a long rectangle of pale light onto the straw. The prisoners near the entrance stirred, expecting a head count or a surprise inspection. It was Corporal Riley. He stood for a moment in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dim evening light. In his hand, he held a small, white object. He stepped inside, letting the heavy door swing shut behind him, plunging the barn back into its usual gloom. A few of the other guards were on the elevated catwalks, but Riley was alone on the floor. The prisoners watched him, a current of silent apprehension passing through the crowd. A lone guard entering the pen was unusual. It meant something specific was about to happen. Annalise's stomach tightened. She watched as he began to walk, not along the roped-off perimeter, but directly into the heart of the prisoner area.
His boots made soft, deliberate sounds in the straw. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the faces until they found her. He was coming for her. Her blood ran cold. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. The silent observation had been a prelude, and now the act was about to begin. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a blow, a harsh command, the humiliation of being dragged to her feet in front of everyone. But the blow never came. She heard him stop just a few feet away. She forced her eyes open. He was standing over her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He knelt down, not aggressively, but with a quiet, deliberate motion. The men around them were dead silent, all eyes fixed on the strange, tense tableau. Riley held out the white object. It was a pillow. A simple, cloth-cased pillow, slightly stained but undeniably soft. He offered it to her. Annalise stared at it, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. A pillow. It made no sense. It was a trick. It had to be a trick. She looked from the pillow to his face. His eyes held no malice, only a kind of quiet, almost nervous intention. He gave a small nod, pushing it slightly closer to her. "Here," he said, his voice low. "You sleep." Her heart was pounding, a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. A wave of panic washed over her. Why? Why would he do this? What did he want in return? Propaganda films flashed in her mind. Devious Americans luring unsuspecting Germans into traps. Was there a razor blade hidden inside? Was it a signal to the other guards? Was this a cruel psychological game, offering a moment of comfort only to snatch it away and laugh at her? Her instincts, reshaped and sharpened by months of war and captivity, screamed that this was danger. This was a threat disguised as charity. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the stone wall, her eyes wide with terror. "9," she whispered, shaking her head. "No." She looked around at the faces of the other German prisoners. They were watching with a mixture of suspicion and confusion. They didn't understand either. The American corporal's face clouded with confusion. He hadn't expected this reaction. He thought she'd be grateful. He tried again, his voice gentle. "It's okay. It's just a pillow." His gentleness only terrified her more. It was the calm voice of the doctor before he gives you the poison. It was the smile of the executioner. The chasm of culture, language, and war between them was too vast to cross. To him, it was a simple act of human decency. To her, it was an aberration, a terrifying break in the predictable pattern of cruelty and indifference she had come to rely on for survival. "Varum," she asked, her voice trembling, pleading. "Why? Why are you giving me this?" She switched to the little English she knew. "What you want." Riley was stunned into silence. He didn't know how to explain it. How could you explain a simple, uncalculated act of kindness to someone who no longer believed such a thing existed? He saw the genuine panic in her eyes and realized he had made a terrible mistake. He had meant to offer a small comfort, but he had only brought her fear. He slowly placed the pillow on the straw in front of her, making sure not to get any closer. He held his hands up in a gesture of peace and backed away slowly. He didn't say another word. He turned and walked back toward the door, the eyes of every prisoner following him. The door opened and closed, and he was gone. She was left alone in the silence, staring at the object on the straw. It was soft. It was clean. And to Annalise Schmidt, it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen.
The silence in the barn after Corporal Riley left was heavy and absolute. It was as if the simple, white pillow on the straw had absorbed all the sound in the cavernous space. Annalise didn't move. She continued to press herself against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her eyes were fixed on the pillow, treating it as if it were an unexploded bomb. The other prisoners stared, first at the pillow, then at her. Their expressions were a mixture of envy, suspicion, and contempt. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. "What was that about?" a voice murmured from the darkness. "She's a collaborator," another hissed, "making friends with the Amis. Maybe they know each other." The accusations were poison darts, isolating her further. In the brutal social ecosystem of a POW camp, any deviation from the norm, any special treatment, was a mark of shame. It meant you were either a spy or a whore. She was now not only a captive of the Americans, but an outcast among her own people. The small bubble of space they had once given her out of respect or awkwardness now felt like a quarantine zone. Annalise ignored them. Her world had shrunk to the space between her and the pillow. For what felt like an hour, she simply stared. Her mind raced, constructing and discarding scenarios. It was a test. They were watching her. If she took it, she would be punished for accepting a gift. If she didn't take it, she would be punished for insubordination.
There was no right answer. Every path led to pain. This was the logic of captivity, a logic that had kept her alive until now. Slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal, she reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers hovered over the cotton fabric for a long moment before she finally allowed them to touch it. The material was soft, worn but clean. There were no hidden wires, no sharp edges. It was just a pillow. She drew her hand back as if burned. The sheer normalcy of it was what was so disorienting. It did not belong here. It was a relic from a different world, a world with beds and warm rooms and safety, a world that no longer existed for her. She looked around the barn. The other prisoners were starting to settle down again, the brief drama over. They were wrapping themselves in thin blankets, curling into balls on the straw, their faces etched with the familiar despair. They had accepted their reality. But the pillow had just shattered hers. Her reality was supposed to be simple. The enemy was cruel, survival depended on mistrust, and the world was made of hard surfaces. This soft, yielding object contradicted everything. It introduced a new variable into the grim equation of her existence, the possibility of unearned mercy. After another long period of stillness, she reached for it again. This time, she pulled it toward her. She held it in her lap, her fingers tracing the seams. It smelled faintly of soap and the outdoors, a clean scent that was utterly alien in the foul air of the barn. It was an object of profound and baffling humanity. Why would he do it? The question hammered at her. Why? He had gained nothing. He had risked reprimand for fraternizing. He had given a small piece of his own comfort to an enemy he didn't know, for no reason she could possibly comprehend. The exhaustion of the past days, the terror of her capture, and the relentless emotional strain of captivity suddenly washed over her in a great silent wave. A single hot tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She didn't make a sound, but her shoulders began to shake with silent, ragging sobs. It wasn't a cry of sadness or fear. It was a cry of profound, soul-shaking confusion. The cruelty she had been prepared for, the violence she understood. But this unintelligible kindness was a blow she had no defense against. It had bypassed all the walls she had built around her heart and struck at the very foundation of her worldview. She lay down on her side, pulling the pillow into the curve of her arm. She rested her head against it. The softness was a shock, a luxury so profound it was almost painful. It didn't bring sleep. Her mind was too alive, too turbulent. But it brought a change. Lying there in the dark, surrounded by the quiet misery of her fellow prisoners, Annalise felt a tiny, fragile crack appear in the wall of her certainty. The world was not as simple as she had been taught. The enemy was not a monolith of evil. In the heart of the monster, she had been shown a moment of inexplicable grace. It did not change the fact that she was a prisoner, that the war raged on, or that her future was a terrifying unknown. But it changed the texture of her despair. It planted a seed of doubt about the nature of her enemy, and in doing so, it planted a seed of hope for the nature of humanity itself. And in the cold, unforgiving darkness of the barn, that was more than she ever thought she would have again.